Good morning. We have only 30 minutes to cover the topic energy autonomy, the race to net zero infrastructure. So we'll try to be direct and short. Carbon neutrality by 2050 in order to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees is an objective now endorsed by a growing number of countries. The strategies implemented to reach a carbon neutral economy may be diverse. However, one common feature in these strategies is a reduction to almost zero of the contribution of energy consumption to carbon emissions, compared to 77% today on the global point of view. The main consequences of this race to net zero will be on the supply side of the energy market, a huge development of renewables, green hydro, maybe nuclear power and carbon capture, and on the demand side, a halt in the consumption of fossil fuels, a massive increase in the use of green power for mobility, heating, manufacturing, and also, of course, a more thrifty society. We are all aware that these big changes will necessitate enormous investment flows in new energy production infrastructure, but with big uncertainties concerning different topics, especially the response of demand to more volatile energy prices, to a higher inflation context, a higher cost of capital. And given this very complex context, it's my great pleasure today to moderate this roundtable composed of 5 specialists, each distinguished in their respective field of expertise. So we have today Vivian NICOLI, who is the Managing Director and Head of Infrastructure for CDPQ in Europe. We have Laurent FAYOLLAS, Deputy Head at Ardian Infrastructure and President of Hy24. We have Karl NIETVELT, who is Chief Analytical Officer at S&P and specialized in global infrastructure ratings. We have Pierre PALMIERI, who is Head of Global Banking and Advisory and Head of Sustainable and Positive Impact Finance at Société Générale. And finally, Patrick TARDIVY, Partner at Orrick. To begin this roundtable, I will ask maybe Karl to set the scene of the energy transition and the main challenges of this race to net zero. Karl, the floor is yours.
Yes, good morning, everyone. It's going to be a race, 26 minutes left. Just 2 minutes to set the scene. I think it is important that we first of all do a reality check. When we talk about net zero, we need to really understand that in Europe, fossil-based fuels represent almost 70% of primary energy, 7-0. We have been successful over the last decade to reduce this percentage by 3–4%. It took us 10 years. The Repower EU plan should double the efforts. By 2030, the share of oil, gas, and coal should trend down to 62% of primary energy. So why I mention this is because when you think about the energy transition, you always need to balance supply and demand. And that's a bigger policy question, which we come back on later. But I would like to highlight a few points of the European climate plans, because they're very, very ambitious. When I say we go from 70% to 62%, that is going to require renewable additions of almost 100 gigawatts per annum. By comparison, 2019-2020, we were having one of the biggest additions of wind and solar power, and the level was around 30 gigawatts. So we're going to have to triple the efforts in the next years. Now, the momentum is there because adding renewables is definitely going to increase our energy autonomy. And to give you one example, according to our utility analyst forecast, the energy that renewable additions will displace is around 12 to 15 billion cubic meters of gas each year. So over an 8-year period, if all these renewable additions come online, and again, it's extremely ambitious, it would save almost 100 billion cubic meters of gas. That's a theoretical question, because as we will see later, we still will need gas, but theoretically it equates to 100 BCM, which is 2/3 of the Russian historic gas supplies. So with this introduction, I just want to say the energy transition is going to be very gradual, and that we cannot ignore the fact that we still have start from a fossil-based economy, and that in itself will require a lot of challenges to transition in a resilient manner, as was mentioned as well earlier on.
Thank you, Karl. With this quick introduction to set the scene of the net zero race, I will ask now maybe to Vivian to explain to us how do you integrate the net zero goal into your investment financing strategy, and to be more specific, maybe to have a focus on the role of gas in your strategy, and also maybe on a specific point on the place of nuclear power in your investment strategy.
Yeah, thank you. The goal and objective of getting to net zero is completely central and embedded in the way that CDPQ looks at the world. We started actually our energy transition, or our objectives, in 2017. And in 2022, we have found that we vastly actually met our objectives ahead of scale. So what we've done is we've even actually tried to set the bar higher for the institution. And of course, we're very conscious of the fact that we set a role model. We try to actually encourage the fund managers in which we invest to follow these kind of standards. So it's important that we kind of do what we say. Our transition to net zero is founded on 4 pillars. And the first pillar is investment in green assets. So today we have about 39 billion CAD of investments in green investments. Our objective is in 2025 to get to 59 billion. So that means, doing the math, 15 billion more, 5 billion each year to actually reach that goal. And you may ask, well, what happens when we reach the goal? And I'm sure that we will try to actually continue to set high standards for ourselves in terms of investments in green assets. The second pillar is carbon reduction. We set some initial standards, some initial goals in 2017. We've met them. We now actually have a goal of reducing our carbon emissions by 60% in the portfolio by 2030, which will set us well on our way to actually meeting net zero in 2050. The third pillar is withdrawing from investments in petrol. So our goal is to withdraw in any petrol production by the end of this year. We're well on our way. We think we'll meet it. The fourth pillar is to invest in an energy transition envelope. So we've set aside 10 billion to actually invest in projects which are involved in energy transition. And what does that mean? It's like, for instance, taking a coal-fired power plant and actually transitioning it to a more green energy like biomass. So those are the 4 pillars. We also continue, just to respond to the question of Jean, we do continue actually to invest in gas. We consider it a transition energy, and Karl has mentioned the huge needs that we still have in energy, and so it remains a transition energy. But as I've mentioned, petrol we are withdrawing from that kind of energy. And then the last kind of energy, which I've been asked to comment about, is nuclear. Nuclear is considered a green energy by CDPQ, and it is an energy that we can invest in. That being said, I mean, I have a bit of personal exposure to nuclear. I was on my first nuclear power plant site at the age of 10, as I actually followed my father because he was designing the nuclear reactor. And I also understand the challenges. And so just very briefly, and maybe actually others may want to comment on the financeability of nuclear, but nuclear makes sense where the structure is correct. So for instance, if it's in the form of a PPP with governmental support, that might make sense for us. But we also have to actually be very conscious on the bankability, and of course, Sokshen can talk a little bit about the bankability, and also the construction risk, construction overruns, cost overruns, and also the robustness and the viability of the technology. That is incredibly important. So where actually everything can be met, certainly we can look at nuclear, and it certainly, at least in my mind, it does have an important place in the future of energy security.
Thank you, Vivian. I will ask the same questions to Laurent and Pierre to give us their point of view on the importance of net zero in their investments and financing strategies. Laurent?
Thank you, Jean. Yes, so on Ardian side, I think it's at the heart of the way we'd like to invest. And I would say energy transition is something super important. I would add energy efficiency also. So everything that could reduce the carbon print of our asset is of importance. As Vivian, we're looking at, let's say, developing more green development and I would say expertise. So currently we are developing a fund dedicated to renewable evergreen funds. We are also developing, and we reached the amount of 1.8 billion on I-24. So this is a pure player on all value chain for hydrogen, so production, transport, use, storage also. So that's really what we're pushing extremely hard on. But I would say also on our existing portfolio. First thing for us is to measure things, right? So we got, and I think it's a strong push within the team, some people like analyzing all data. So we got data scientists in the team looking at measuring, for example, scope 1, 2, 3 of the assets. Taking some example, we got air carbon for the airport in Italy. We got already 3 airports having online the measurement of CO2 emission on the 3 scope. We got the same for motorways with carbon. And that is, I think, something super important because then, based on this, you can implement strategy, you can develop solution to reduce the carbon emission. Very interesting also is the fact that we got all our management company got in their, let's say, objective, the carbon reduction footprint, right? So it's not only wishful thinking, it's really we are measuring, you get an objective, you need to deliver. So that I think is very strong. Very similarly to Vivian, I think we are pushing hard to, in our existing, I would say, asset to reduce the carbon emission. It could mean that for I mean, I would say sometime we could take, for example, and I got one example, NIETVELT in Finland, where we had a district heating company with biomass, but for some plants, peat. And all the goals of peat is coal, in a sense. all the goal was to say, okay, we enter that company, but we get a plan. Within 2 years, we get rid of the pit. So that kind of, I would say, approach is also extremely important because it's not only moving to green, where you get a strong flow of, I would say, energy and fund moving on that, but it's also, let's take something which is in between, a bit gray on part of it, and moving to clean. We got another example. I think we're invested in EWE in Germany, so the fourth utility in Germany. We move forward to close a coal plant on this one over the last 2 years, and we switch the mix of the company from 40% renewable to 60% in 2 years, 2 year time, and we want to continue exactly that kind of approach. We're looking also, I was mentioning I-24, but also at Ardian hydrogen, right? Because hydrogen is, I mean, there's a plus, it should be green, first of all, we're pushing for green and less blue, but it's a way also to store the energy. So definitely you need to think at what price, definitely this is important. But we are developing tons of projects looking at what we can do with hydrogen. So, for example, 2 airports. Milan is looking at reducing the carbon footprint and district heating. Milan on the mobility, air side and public side. And we got, for example, a storage project, Geocell in the south of France, where we want to use some salt cavern to store the hydrogen. We get the connection to the port, Fos. We get the connection to the clients at Lamed. We only need electrolyzer and solar panel just to get the full value chain on the hydrogen. So that is really what we are pushing for, and it's extremely important. It's in all our investment today.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Maybe Pierre, for your point of view as a banker.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning to all of you. Yes, we do have a commitment to be carbon neutral by 2050. And therefore, we are aligning our portfolios in order to get there. So among other steps we have taken, or commitments we have taken, first of all, we want to exit coal, and we've got a plan to be at zero exposure to coal in non-emerging countries by 2030 and by 2040 for emerging countries. The second thing is that we have a target of decreasing our oil and gas upstream commitments by 10% between 19 and 25. Third, we've got a commitment to decrease our CO2 emissions linked to our portfolio of financing of power generation. On the other side, of course, we're not only decreasing some activities, but we are investing massively. We've got a commitment to contribute to 300 billion euros between 22 and 25 to finance the energy transition through the different products, or green bonds, for instance. But, of course, with the financing of renewables being a key part of this commitment. So renewables, hydrogens, interconnectors, battery projects, and so on and so forth. And probably we have some time to go into this in more details. So now, what about the situation of the gas? And I think gas was already a very complex topic. Because there are a lot of debates about, should gas be considered as a transition energy or not? But given what's happening in Europe, it's even more the case now. So the situation for me is the following, is that gas, of course, very short term is needed, but will be needed anyway for quite a while in Europe for many reasons. It would be too long to talk about this right now. And at the center of this equation is the LNG. Europe will have to import more LNG in, of course, very short term, but also in the years to come. This has several consequences. The first is that Europe will need long-term contracts. But in order to have long-term contracts, the players will have to hedge. And given the high level of prices and volatility, this means a lot of margin calls, and we have seen all the energy system under huge pressure in the past few months. So the role of the banks there, and we have done this, we have supported our clients through a lot of liquidity lines, and this will be key going forward. The ecosystem, for the moment, is not optimal in order to work in this new highly volatile market. Second, we will need infrastructures in order to get more LNG inside Europe, terminals, regasification projects. Third, what about LNG projects in the exporting countries, the US and the Gulf? So on all this, of course, banks like us will have a key role in financing not only the short term, the flows, the hedging, but also all these infrastructure projects. Last thing about nuclear, we do not have a policy that prevents us from financing nuclear projects. There are not so many for the moment, but of course we are able to play a role in this regards. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you for this first set of questions regarding your own strategy. I will now turn to the policy makers and maybe to ask a question. Are net zero public policies amply enough designed and oriented today? Is it only a question of sufficient funding and pragmatic goals? Is the European taxonomy a useful tool for your own activity? These are three questions about the current public policies in terms of energy transition and race to net zero. And I will ask maybe to Patrick to introduce discussion on this topic.
Thank you, Jean. Well, the race to net zero, I think it's going to be a race because, as we see, it's even more complex in the current geopolitical environment. And as always, when there's a race, there needs to be rules, there needs to be incentives. So what are we seeing today? We're seeing two types of rules, what I would call a bit of soft regulation, although some might disagree it is soft, and a bit more of a hard regulation. The soft regulation is what we're seeing today. I mean, I think taxonomy is one of that, the labeling as well that we're seeing about sustainable infrastructure is also part of that. And also what we've seen lately about on public companies about say on climate, right? Yeah. All of these soft regulation have the same purpose, which is basically making sure that investors know what they're investing in and that they direct their investment flows towards general partners or strategic investors who are having a strategy to invest in sustainable infrastructure. And as part of that, as you will all know, taxonomy is moving at the moment to include nuclear and gas, right? Because the transition will rely partly on those energies. On the more hard side of the regulation, I mean, when we think about public policy, we often think about subsidies. And indeed, I'll come back to subsidies because they are important. But there are many, many other aspects about regulation. Yeah. And one of that is how you facilitate the implementation of green energy. I mean, one of the great, I would say, example we've seen is that it's taken more than 10 years in France for the first offshore wind farm to become live. And that was nothing to do with the appetite from investors. Yeah. This was all about the regulatory framework, which made it more complicated than some of our neighbors. Of course, now we're seeing there's a draft law that is being proposed by the government at the moment to accelerate renewables, and it goes into facilitating permitting, but also by imposing some rules on owner of park space. For instance, to put shade houses that with renewables and photovoltaic production. Or on top of that, we're seeing about the same in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, but which is slightly more on the subsidy side. So then the question is, what should we do with those subsidies? I mean, there have been incentives for renewables in France for quite long, and they've allowed the development of wind farms and photovoltaic in particular, but other type of renewables. The question, of course, today is that should that shift to new energies, hydrogen, storage, all those sort of things. It's a very difficult one because I think it's not obvious that the existing renewable have reached the level of maturity where we could completely lift that. So maybe we should think of different regulation. Maybe we should think of new framework. What has been extremely efficient in France is the fiber high-speed plan, which has been a great success, I think, in terms of developing connectivity at a very quick pace. And so that could be something we can think, for instance, about mobility and green mobility.
Thank you, Patrick. Concerning mobility, maybe Laurent, you wanted to say a few things about mobility.
No, I think what have been said by Patrick is super important.
We have only 4 minutes
left. I'll take please cut me if I'm too long. No, first of all, regulation, I think we need really to follow what is under discussion, for example, in Europe. There's a lot of regulation ongoing, like RED 3, like AFIR, like the definition on what could be seen as green hydrogen, for example. So that would be extremely important to get the right regulation to move quickly. The other point is a bit like on fiber, how to move at scale. For example, just taking the example of hydrogen, we are seeing a lot of subsidy going to equipment, going to industry, and I think we're missing for the time being, it should come, but infrastructure and mobility. And mobility, I think, would be at the heart of all the value chain, because what the use of having green hydrogen if you can't use it, if you don't get the trucks, the heavy vehicles, whatever, plane or shipping, ships that can use that technology. So I would say the idea of Patrick saying, okay, let's do something like the Grenelle of the hydrogen, and making sure that we could put, for example, don't know, a bit what German people are doing, 200, 300 stations on the road, on motorways, on key node of the I would say road sector, would be a catalyst, and then it would help, I would say, a car manufacturer to start the production. I guess people like Stellantis were discussing with Renault already. So I really think that kind of, let's say, regulation and catalysts need to be, I would say, bring very quickly.
Thank you, Laurent. I'm sorry, but I think that we have only 1 or 2 minutes left. Maybe Karl, I can give you the conclusion to make on this roundtable.
Conclusion. Yes, to finish, I do want to say that renewables remains the most efficient way to decarbonize. We need all the solutions, though, because certain industries need a gaseous solution. The power sector needs a gaseous solution in order to manage storage and seasonality. But I also want to finish on the other point of the equation, which is not just the supply side. On the supply side, many initiatives, it's also on the demand side. If we think about credit, long-term investor views, we need to be anticipating that customer behavior and policy change that helps the customer behavior will be an important driver as well. And this is the most difficult part to forecast, no? But if you think about the European members of parliament last month are discussing how we can impose a 40% energy efficiency target, 40. How that will pan out is very difficult to foresee, but I'm going to give, to finish, 2 examples. The airline industry. we will see over time changes in travel behavior. Some of that will be purely because of climate change, people becoming more conscious, but also policies are changing. The example is in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, Schiphol, where the government actually imposed a limit on ATMs, air traffic movements. This is going to affect the growth of an airport, and that is driven by environmental reasons. The same thing when people think about another example of the Netherlands, I'm not from the Netherlands, but from Belgium, but is the agricultural change. We are going to see there caps on farms and cattle, but governments need to think about the demand side. If people continue to eat as much meat as before, we're just going to import it. So I just want to finish on this note that it's not only the supply side, it's also on the customer behavior. We all can contribute and all are changing habits, but policies may change in that respect as well, and some that's more unforeseen. So as infrastructure investors, we need to take that long-term view.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry for having maybe only 30 minutes for this debate. Thank you very much to everybody.